This episode of the Best Armies in 40k is sponsored by Connell Narrative and their Narrative Warhammer 40k events. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of the Best Armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from the past week of competitive play and talk about what is winning. This is for the weekend of July 19th and 20th, 2026, and we saw some absolutely massive events go down this weekend, including more super majors in 11th edition. That includes the Warhammer Open Tacoma, as well as the Edinburgh Super Major. So we have a lot of massive events to talk about. And that's going to move us over to a metagame breakdown. And looking at the faction breakdown for this week, we can see that the story from last week basically continues. The orc dominance of the metagame has continued to the point that we saw them not only take down the largest event of the week, the Warhammer Open Tacoma, but the Tacoma Finals was an orc mirror match. So we have seen them as the most dominant faction with the most undefeated results. However, we do see some other factions creeping up. So orcs taking down the Warhammer Open Tacoma with an undefeated result at the Bordeaux Open. That event was 100 players, but ended up being only 5 rounds, so we saw a lot of undefeated results from that one. Yeehaw 2026, as well as the O Conquest, where they went 4-0-1, so 1 draw on the record. From there, however, Space Marines are doing incredibly well. We see both Salamanders and Dark Angels with several event wins, that being at the Goonhammer 2026, London Open Series July, as well as Warhammer Bunker Summer Tournament. Dark Angels for some more Green Arbor Space Marine action, taking down the Edinburgh Super Major, as well as going undefeated at the Athens Open Summer Edition and Aether Force Gaming Summer Siege GT. We also see Chaos Space Marines with a similar number of wins at the Palm Springs Classic, Yeehaw 2026, a smaller event here, the Macarian Crusade, as well as Capital Clash The Revolution. Necrons with 3 undefeated results from Historicon, Road to Nova, Fleur de Lis GT, as well as the Palm Springs Classic, and even more Space Marines doing well. Ultramarines at the Malaga Open, as well as Waterloo Games, Road to Nova GT. Thousand Sons also saw success at the Bordeaux Open, as well as the Historicon, Road to Nova GT. Tyranids with an undefeated spot at the Edinburgh Super Major, as well as the Winchester GT. Chaos Demons going undefeated 5-0 with a perfect score, in fact, at the Aether Force Gaming Summer Siege GT, and last but certainly not least, Imperial Knights, also with a 5-0 record at the Bordeaux Open. And now, let's talk about these lists, just after a word from our sponsor. If you want to battle over the skies of Armageddon and fight for the fate of the war world, you can do so with our sponsor today, Connell Narrative. Connell Narrative specializes in running immersive and story-driven events for Warhammer 40,000. And today I'm here to tell you about their upcoming event, October 10th through 11th, 2026, put on to benefit cancer research. This 2-day event runs 5 games and allows teams of 5 to compete for the fate of the battle zone, using a modified match play system alongside the Dominatus deck that's meant to be a little bit simpler and more immersive than standard match play formats. The event's being run at the Battle Standard in East Windsor, Connecticut, a game store that I've been to many times and is one of my favorites. The Battle Standard prides itself on an immersive atmosphere and lends itself to narrative play, and has enough space to fit 40 players at this event. So check the links in the video description to get your tickets today for Armageddon Dominatus, and immerse yourself in the war for Armageddon. You can get your tickets for the event through the Battle Standard website, and you can find those in the QR code on screen or in the links down in the video description. So get those tickets today and immerse yourself in the war for Armageddon on October 10th through 11th, 2026. And find out more about Connell Narrative, learn about their event structure, and get notifications for upcoming events at connellnarrative.com. So let's start with our metagame frontrunner Orcs and make our way over to the Warhammer Open Tacoma, which was won by Orcs, being run by Conan Jennings. This was an Orc mirror match in the finals, showcasing at this high-level play how dominant Orcs are at controlling the midboard and using the reactive moves to push tempo in the game. In this case, Conan was playing a combination of Green Tide and Tactical Brigade. This includes Gazgul Thraka, attached to a Big Boss, Pain Boy, and a Boy Squad. 20 boys in that one, with bloodthirsty belligerents on the Big Boss, with a second big brick, that being a War Boss, Big Boss with Ferocious Show-Off, alongside a Pain Boy, and a second unit of 20 boys. We also then had a Worm Boss, big boss with Mork's Cunning, attached with a Pain Boy and another unit of 20 boys. Following that up was 2 more units of 20 boys, as well as a Storm Boys unit. As a little bit of additional spot removal, we have Wazdak and Gutsmech, as well as some additional utility from a Gretchen squad and a Commando unit. Now, because of Tactical Brigade, all these boys, as well as these Storm Boys units, all get the ability to advance and perform actions, so they're incredibly effective in a utility role. Plus, you can throw forward these 20 model boy squads with no attached characters. They're relatively difficult to kill thanks to Green Tide. They can surge move when they're targeted, and then the kicker is that once they push forward, they hit a big charge, and they engage a bunch of stuff. You fall back from them, they can use on to the next to move, and once targeted by an attack, they can re-engage into melee during your shooting phase. It's incredibly scary, and once you get in with the character-led bricks, those characters will start doing some absolutely immense amounts of damage. The orcs themselves are okay at doing damage. They don't do an immense amount, but they will take so much table space, and they will deliver those big bosses, those war bosses, who will actually start killing people. It is able to use the take and hold forces position incredibly well because it's going to occupy the center of the battlefield so effectively with so many units that are difficult to answer, and if you don't have the attack volume to kill these 20 model orc boy squads in one tap, essentially, things get really, really tough for you, especially because they're layering defensive mechanics. They have a surge move, they have a 5+ invuln save, are all game wide, as long as they are a large enough unit count or model count inside their unit. Plus, they have the Pain Boy for a 5+ feel no pain, plus they get several effects overlapping that can regenerate boys back into the unit. So they're tough to kill, they engage everything, they can react once they're engaged, and if you don't kill them, they're going to obstruct those center objectives and just push the take and hold primary score absolutely through the roof. And so with all that in mind, it's no surprise that they did feel so dominant in events this weekend. Now, another faction that uses this massive pressure to take the center of the battlefield is going to be Chaos Space Marines, which took down the Yeehaw 2026. Now, this event also saw 2 factions go undefeated. Orcs were one of them. The other one was Chaos Space Marines running Fellhammer Siege Host, another take and hold detachment. In this case, Nick Toomey Dutes, if you are familiar with the online circuit, who runs the Black Crusade Open series of online tournaments, and has another one starting, I think, basically as I record this. So if you're interested in online play, you can go check out his circuit. But he ended up taking down this event in a first place finish with this combination of detachments. This includes Abaddon the Despoiler in a unit of Chosen, Huron Blackheart plus the Masters of the Maelstrom and a big unit of 10 Chosen, in addition to Vashdor the Archifane, a Terminator squad, 1 Defiler, a Red Corsair Raider unit, and a unit of Felgor Beastmen. Now, the Cabal of Chaos detachment here isn't super helpful. However, it does provide a little bit of a bonus specifically to the Masters of the Maelstrom. Because they are a Psyker keyword, because one of the Masters is a Psyker, they are able to use Infernal Vigor to heal D3+1 wounds and resurrect models back to the unit, in addition to resurrections offered by Gary and the Corpse Master. But the real thing here is, of course, Fellhammer Siege Host, which gives you lots and lots of overlapping defensive mechanics. We can use Abaddon the Despoiler for a 4+ invulnerable save. We can also then get -1 to be wounded against ranged attacks in some circumstances, depending on their stat line, as well as having a 5+ feel no pain. So the army is just way more difficult to kill than you expect it is explicitly against ranged attacks. Now, being able to bring this massive brick of Chosen, plus the Masters, plus Huron Blackheart in the center of the battlefield and push them up right in the middle is incredibly difficult to deal with, especially since they have reactive moves, Plunder the Dog, and all of these overlapping effects. Vashdor the Archifane is a great deep strike target, especially alongside the Defiler. He can push the Defiler's guns up to pretty high strength characteristics, in addition to just being able to sit next to the Defiler and hold down territory while being lone operative. Typically, we will also see a character for the Chaos Terminator squad, but it looks like this particular list is taking a higher volume of units instead. Usually that's either a Kravik Morn, or we see a Terminator Lord with the Bastion Plate to make that unit even more difficult to kill. It looks like we've left that at home, however, and the Terminator squad is just another relatively resilient brick of models who is good in Overwatch and can rapid ingress into spooky areas of the battlefield. The Felgor Beastmen are an interesting selection. They are a very minor expense over a standard unit of cultists, but they do give you a turn 1 deep strike effect, a turn 1 strategic reserve, which allows you to score some weirder secondaries. So things like outflank on turn 1 or beacon, for example, you may be able to complete early because you can bring them out of strategic reserve as if it was a further turn. We then also have a Red Corsair Raider unit for some mid-board control. But that wasn't the only Chaos Space Marine list to go undefeated this weekend. We also saw several builds running Renegade Raiders, the more aggressive detachment that's all about fast movement and bonuses targeting enemies on objectives. Incredibly good if your opponent has forced dispositions, like Take and Hold or like Priority Assets, where a lot of their units do need to take those objectives. In this case, it is using the Reconnaissance Force disposition, and we also saw it take down the Capital Clash The Revolution. This was won by Joe Loke, who won using, again, here on Black Cards, Masters of the Maelstrom, and a Chosen Brick, only 5 models this time, and Vanisher with the Archifane. So very similar character selection. However, they did a lot of battle line units, 2 units of Chaos Cultists, in addition to a 5-model Legionnaire squad being delivered by a pair of Chaos Rhinos. We then also have a Red Corsair Raider squad for early game disruption, plus 2 Noise Marine squads to shoot out of the top of the Rhinos. A little bit of an interesting piece of technology there is that the Noise Marines, when being fired using a firing deck, can actually utilize the Dark Pacts of the Chaos Rhino themselves. So the Blastmasters shooting out at the top of those Rhinos do give those things a pretty decent range profile, especially alongside all of the anti-infantry shots, which are now much more relevant against light infantry than they were in previous editions because of the changes to cover. The Chaos Rhino is going to be able to put down 2 Combi Bolter shots in addition to a Havoc Launcher attack, which can oftentimes be somewhere around 14 or 15 attacks, depending on the size of the target unit, which in conjunction with the Red Corsair units makes you able to destroy enemy utility without actually having to commit anything to the fight. Then you can also dump those guys out and use a stratagem to gain rerolls when you disembark a transport. Lastly, we also have 2 Defilers laying down some cannon fire. That includes battle cannons as well as Reaper autocannons on the side-mounted weapons for those big walkers. Now, moving on from there to some Space Marine factions, let's talk about Dark Angels. The Edinburgh Supermajor was another large event from the weekend, 230 players, and saw Innes Wilson, the stat checker himself, taking it down with Dark Angels. This is a combination of Inner Circle Task Force and Librarius Conclave. Now, obviously, we know Librarius Conclave from previous weeks. It is the single most popular Space Marine detachment. It might be the most popular detachment in the entire game currently. Inner Circle Task Force, however, is the Deathwing style detachment that allows you to choose a footing at the start of your movement phase, either a defensive footing that chooses an objective you control to become your vowed objective, or an aggressive push that chooses an objective you do not control and grants your Deathwing units +1 to wounds targeting enemies on vowed objectives. Given that units like Sternguard and Blade Guard veterans, as well as many characters such as Azrael, have the Deathwing keyword baked in, either on their datasheet or thanks to the Deathwing rule that Dark Angels have access to, this actually benefits a ton of units, popular units inside the Space Marine faction, and benefits them not only with that +1 to wound, but also many of their stratagems. In this case, we were running Azrael plus a Lieutenant and a 10-model Intercessor squad. Pretty interesting here, because those Intercessors are gonna get the benefit of that detached ability and gain that +1 to wound with their 40 bolter shots plus their special weapons, alongside lethal hits from their Lieutenant. We have a Librarian in Terminator armor with Temporal Corridor, alongside a Deathwing Knight squad, plus a second Terminator Librarian with Celerity to make them a little bit more mobile in a second Deathwing Knight squad. Those together will really overcome a big part of the Deathwing Knight's weakness, which is their maneuverability. The Celerity unit obviously gets access to fallback or advance and charge. The Temporal Corridor can redeploy itself around the battlefield if it ever finds itself stuck into a combat that it can't really fight its way out of. We then have a Librarian inside an Inner Circle Companion unit. All of those units naturally have the Deathwing keyword, and that Librarian will offset the downside of Inner Circle Companions, which is that they do not have a natural invulnerable save. So they are a little susceptible to anti-heavy infantry fire, which the Librarian can shore up with his Psychic Shield. We then have another Librarian with Fusillade, the classic combination to gain anti-monster, anti-vehicle 5-up, inside a Sternguard veteran squad, which gets full rerolls targeting their Oath of Moment target. So between that unit and Azrael, we have 2 units that once they can jump in and target their Oath of Moment target, they can do massive amounts of damage. We then have a combi weapon Lieutenant, as well as an Invader ATV and a pair of Scout Squads for utility, 2 Land Speeders for some early game utility as well. In this case, we are using the Priority Assets Force disposition, which allows the army to play a little bit more passively than it would in a lot of other cases, which allows you, again, to further offset that maneuverability issue that many of these Deathwing units have on the board. Incredibly interesting combination of effects, being able to utilize the characters and the Deathwing units alongside Librarius Conclave and the buffs given by the Psyker units makes a combination of detachments that can force multiply these squads a massive amount. Now, in addition to that, we also saw Dark Angels doing well at the 8th or 4th Gaming Summer Siege Warhammer 40k GT. Try saying that 10 times fast. And this was with a slightly different combination of Dark Angels detachments, Librarius Conclave, and the Unforgiven Task Force, the detachment that allows you to offset the downsides of being battle-shocked. In this case, this was run by Mark Devlin, running Azrael in a unit of Inner Circle Companions to give them their invulnerable save. We also had again, Librarian and Terminator armor with Temporal Corridor inside a Deathwing Knight unit to make them a little faster, a second Terminator Librarian with no upgrades inside another Deathwing Knight squad. Interestingly, we had a Phobos Librarian with Prescience inside an Eliminator squad. Now, the Eliminator squad was equipped with Las Fusils for a little bit of anti-tank work or anti-heavy infantry shooting. However, it did not include an Instigator Bullet Carbine to allow it to shoot and scoot, but that Prescience enhancement does make it incredibly difficult to pin down. The Phobos Librarian does give it a pseudo-lone operative effect. It can't be targeted by ranged attacks outside 12 inches. What's interesting about that is that it doesn't care about the hidden mechanic or any detection range modifiers whatsoever. You simply can't target them at all. So if you're outside 12, he just doesn't even care, even if you have any sort of expanded detection range. In addition to that, he has that reactive move. So when you move up close to him to try to attack him, he's going to jump away. So you have to only engage him from that explicit band of essentially outside 8 inches, but within 12 inches, which of course the controlling player can kind of manipulate by not putting them too close to enemies. On top of that, we also have a Librarian with the Stormguard Veteran Squad with the Fusillade enhancement, an Intercessor squad for backline objective control, a little bit of support being applied by an Infiltrator squad plus a Jump Pack Assault Intercessor squad, an Outrider squad, as well as a Scout squad, and a little bit of ranged attacks coming from a Ballistus Dreadnought and a Landspeeder Vengeance. A little bit of an eclectic combination of ranged attackers there, but with those Brickship Deathwing Knights taking up the midboard alongside the Inner Circle Companions, this army is able to duke it out in the center of the battlefield, and those guys can hold down the flanks just fine. Continue our discussion of green armored Space Marine armies. We can talk about the Goonhammer 2026, which was won by Garrett Olson, who went 5-0-1. That's one draw on the record with Salamanders. Garrett was playing a combination of Forgefather Seekers as well as Librarius Conclave, in this case running Vulcan Heston plus a 5-model Infernus squad, a Gravis Captain with a Flamestorm Aggressor squad. This gives you a discount on your Immolation Protocol, so you can give those guys wound rerolls just because they have Twin Linked on their weapons, just naturally, and then also Devastating Wounds on their attacks. That then allows you to point Vulcan's buff elsewhere to buff your Meltas or your Flamers without having to use that on your Immolation Protocol combo. We have Adrax Agatone inside a Blade Guard Veteran squad to act as a counterpunch, a Librarian with Immolator, so +1 attacks on Torrent weapons inside an Infernus squad. Those guys do incredible damage and are typically where Vulcan wants to be pointing his buff on. Those guys are going to be firing 10d6 plus 10 strength 6 AP1 flamer shots. You can Immolation Protocols them as well if you need the Mortal Wound output. And speaking of Mortal Wound output, we have, again, the classic combination of Fusillade plus a Stern Guard Veteran squad. We have an Intercessor squad for the back line, a unit of Jump Pack Assault Intercessors, one additional Infernus squad, there's 5 in that unit. Those guys are pretty good because they get the ability to advance and perform actions, or shoot and perform actions, which lets them act as utility units very effectively, and they can also just saturate the board with solid Overwatch threats. One big thing in 11th edition is the basically impossibility of blocking Overwatch entirely. Something is going to walk into the threat range of something that's going to be good in Overwatch, and almost every time you have a good Overwatch threat on the table, you're going to be able to utilize it to remove models from the opponent's army. Even if your opponent doesn't want to engage with something like the Immolator Brick or Vulcan Heston, or the Land Raider Redeemers elsewhere in the list, because they would get cooked in Overwatch, you're probably going to be able to get a shot with your Infernus squad. Speaking of which, we also have an Outrider squad for a little bit of additional disruption, plus 2 Land Raider Redeemers, in order to deliver units like the Stern Guard Veterans and the Immolator Brick, and as well as Adrax Agatone. Sticking with Salamanders for a moment, we can discuss the London Open Series July, which was won by Will B. He was running a very similar version of Forgefather Seekers and Librarius Conclave that I want to just cover real quick. It did have a lot of similar hallmarks, including the Immolator Brick alongside a Librarian, a Fusillade Librarian with the Stern Guard Veteran Squad, but this time was running 10 Terminators. These are shooty Terminators with the combination of Power Fist, Stormbolters, and Cyclone Missile Launchers, alongside a Celerity Terminator Librarian to improve their threat range. We were running Vulcan Heston all by himself. As we've discussed before, he is actually just kind of a monster to kill. He's a 4+ Fail No Pain when he's on his chosen objective and can get hidden or gone to ground for being in that objective and behind any of the dense terrain features on the objective terrain element, which means he can just basically sit in the middle of the table, draw a line of sight to most areas of the central position of the battlefield, and be relatively tough to kill, plus putting 10 OC there, which is huge. We have 2 5-man Inferno squads, 1 Land Raider Redeemer, a Land Speeder Scout squad, Repulsor, and 3 Suppressor squads. Now, the Suppressor squads are cool for a bunch of different reasons. First of all, they have the combination of flying and heavy. We've discussed previously that there is a little bit of weirdness with the combination of these mechanics. Flying allows you to ignore vertical distances while you're moving, and heavy allows you to get +1 to hit as long as you didn't move more than 3 inches. Whether or not the heavy keyword counts the movement from moving vertically while flying, I think is depending on the event, but in any case, you are likely able to get both plunging fire and heavy, even if it takes you a turn of movement to get up there. That allows you to offset the relatively poor ballistic skill of the Suppressor autocannon and apply -1 to hit to enemies that you shoot at, which is stackable with cover, because cover is a ballistic skill modifier, not itself a hit modifier. That allows you to keep your heavy vehicles like your Repulsor and your Land Raider Redeemer alive for longer, which I think is really cool. Also, turns out putting a bunch of Terminators on the battlefield, also very cool. These guys being able to hop in using a teleport homer or jump in and just shoot at a target that has Oath of Moment for +1 wound and a bunch of rerolls allows these guys to really push the opponent's objective without having to use on-the-table movement, which you are required to do so with things like the Repulsor and the Land Raiders. We're going to stay on Space Marines for a moment here and discuss our blue armored boys, the Ultramarines. We'll give green a rest and head on over to a more primary color. In this case, Mark Hurdle took down the Waterloo Games Road to Nova event with Ultramarines. This using a combination of Librarius Conclave and Vanguard Spearhead. Vanguard Spearhead solves kind of one of the issues that Librarius Conclave occasionally has, which is the delivery of its damage-dealing bricks. Obviously, units like the Sternguard Veteran Squad can do phenomenal amount of damage when they target their Oath of Moment target. However, they have a tough time actually getting into range since they deal the most damage within 12 inches, which can be a little bit tough. However, Vanguard Spearhead can solve that by giving them the ability to redeploy into Strategic Reserve, and then you can use the combination of using Uriel Ventress to give that unit Deep Strike. That allows you to, on Battle Round 2 onwards, place that unit basically anywhere you want within 12 inches of a juicy target and blast them away. In this case, we're running Uriel Ventress plus a Company Hero squad to make them tougher. A Sternguard Veteran squad, just 5 models in that one, alongside Tigurius himself. He makes them -1 to be hit, which can stack with cover, which makes the unit kind of tanky. Plus, when they target their Earth of the Moment target, their rerolls from the Sternguard veterans affects Tigurius as well, which means they're actually able to do some pretty serious damage. He has a very good psychic attack. On top of that, these guys also get a bunch of free stratagems, including things like Overwatch and Heroic Intervention, which is huge. We have another Librarian with Temporal Corridor in another Sternguard veteran squad. 10 models this time. Temporal Corridor to make them a little bit faster, but doesn't really improve their damage that much. However, what of course does is the Fusillade combo. We have a third Librarian or another Psyker alongside Fusillade and a Sternguard veteran squad. In order to unlock the power of the Sternguard veterans, we have Rabute Gilliman, who is going to be able to unlock a second Oath of Moment target, so they're going to be able to get their rerolls more consistently. We have an Intercessor squad, an Impulsor, 1 unit of Assault Jump Back Intercessors, an Inceptor squad, that's going to be 6 Inceptors in that one, alongside Assault Bolters, that gives you another good opportunity to up down a unit and drop them into annoying positions of the battlefield. These guys are also incredibly strong with Strike from the Shadows, which gives them a bonus ballistic skill as well as a bonus AP that essentially offsets the downside of cover. It allows you to reroll a bunch of hits with these guys and usually net more attacks than you ended up starting with because of their sustained hits too. Then firing into their Oath of Moment target, they're +1 to wound and +1 AP. They go to AP2. They can really rinse down even heavy targets that you would expect to survive. And then, if assuming they survive subsequent turns, you can then up down them and 6-inch Deep Strike to get them repositioned and attacking in other areas of the battlefield. They, of course, don't need the help of Uriel Ventress because they have Deep Strike baked into their datasheet. We then have an Infiltrator squad and 2 Scout squads. So this army is going to be able to potentially start one of these units in reserve, up down a second one, drop the Inceptors in all at the same time, clear its 2 Oath of Moment targets, as well as probably knock out a couple other units. The Sternguard veterans themselves have overlapping defensive buffs, whether that is the detachment ability from the Vanguard Spearhead, plus the Librarian Ultramarines attached to them to give them invuln saves, so it's difficult to kill them on the crackback, and then they get another round of basically the entire Ultramarine army activating into your army, which will eventually kills you. From there, we can talk about the Historicon GT, which I had the opportunity to go check out while I was at the event. This one ended up being won by TJ Lanigan, running Thousand Suns, running the combination of Hexorb, Thrallband, and a Ritual of Regeneration. That gives you a very interesting combination of effects, which allows you to focus very heavily on your rubric-led units in order to then use Ritual of Regeneration to keep them topped up, and the Hexorb, Thrallband detachment ability in order to actually improve their damage with rerolls or +1 to wound. We have an Infernal Master in this case, alongside a Rubric Marine squad, plus a second Infernal Master alongside another Rubric Marine squad, a Sorcerer with Empiric Onslaught for additional attacks inside a third Rubric Marine squad. Would you believe it? We have a Terminator Sorcerer with Curse of Life inside a Scarab Occult Sorcerer, Scarab Occult Terminator unit, 10 Scarab Occults in that case. Magnus the Red, the Great Man himself, alongside a Defiler, a pair of Zangor Enlightened units for utility, and a Fate Caster Greatbow Zangor Enlightened unit. This is a little bit different than the Sekitar robot focus builds that we see inside Sekitar Cohort. It's a little bit more offensively oriented. You're not using the board control from the Sekitar robots in the early game, but instead you have more of that hyper consistent attacks from things like the Infernal Masters. Now, not having to worry about cover at all with those guys means that they can just consistently fire. They can overwatch basically as well as Sekitar robots. The downside being, of course, that they don't do it for free, but they're putting so many torrent attacks down at 18 inches. It's very difficult to get close to this army, and with most of them benefiting from +1 to wound, the attacks that they're dealing are massively damaging. Now, second place based on tiebreakers at that event was also 5-0 and playing Necrons. This is Max Burlov running Starshatter Arsenal. In this case, he was playing a Technomancer with Chrono Impedance Fields to reduce damage, a Canoptic Wraith squad alongside him. We had a Kashan Shard of the Void Dragon plus Necrosaur Amintar and the Silent King, the Great Man himself. A Canoptic Reanimator to keep these units topped up, alongside a Canoptic Tomb Crawler squad. I think these guys are being played independently. I'm not 100% sure. Because they don't have a leader ability, I'm not actually sure when they're meant to attach into a unit, whether that's in list construction or in battle formation step. It's probably ends up being in battle formations, but in any case, they can in some cases be used as a separate unit just to act as a relatively resilient utility piece. Speaking of those, however, we have a Death Mark squad, a Flayed One squad, and a Triarch Stalker. The Triarch Stalker is great for early game harassment. You can throw them up into the center of the battlefield, give them Chrono Impedance for -1 damage, reactive move them in response to attacks, and especially since priority assets typically requires your control of specific objectives in the center of the battlefield. The Triarch Stalker is good for completing those objectives early. We then, of course, had a pair of Doomsday Orks to deal some consistent damage. Now, that wasn't the only Necron list to go undefeated this weekend, because we had an absolute banger of a list from the Fleur de Lis GT. This was Corey Schultz, a giant pyramid extraordinaire, running the combination of Obiescence Phalanx and Pharaon's Armory. Our Obiescence Phalanx, of course, has access to a -1 damage stratagem for giant, silly pyramids, and Pharaon's Armory gives them massive amounts of bonus movement, so we're able to just flood the board with hugely fast, enormous super heavies. This list included Imhotep the Stormlord to fuel that stratagem usage. We had the Silent King as well, in order to further buff their movement characteristic, or of course give them rerolls. We have a Canoptic Spider unit to give them a Feel No Pain, a Locust Heavy Destroyer for some utility, an Ophidian Destroyer unit for a little bit of up-down, and then, wait for it, hold, one sec, 3 Monoliths. That was the whole list. Pretty straightforward. Hugely fast. We have 2 defensive strats for use on obviously 2 separate monoliths, one for Armor of Contempt, one for -1 damage. These guys are tough to kill. They're going to deal some pretty serious damage. They're going to pull focus away from the Silent King, who can then beat your opponent down into a pulp after the monoliths start by rinsing down the middle of the table and completing control of the center objectives. Massive, massive list. Absolutely insane. And it looks really cool on the table too. Now, closing out our 2+ X and O factions, we also have Tyranids. Tyranids also went undefeated at the Edinburgh Super Major alongside Dark Angels. In this case, it was a fairly straightforward Tyranid list running Invasion Fleet This was being led by a Broodlord with a 10 model unit of Genestealers, a Hive Tyrant with Perfectly Adapted to give him some floating rerolls, very helpful, a Neuro Tyrant, as well as the Red Terror. The Red Terror is a great piece in a lot of cases, especially because in Invasion Fleet, getting sustained hits on its weapons means that it's fairly consistent because it has a high volume attack, and it's good at destroying enemy utility and then disappearing, which gives you the ability to engage with enemies without having to actually leave stuff in the center of the table, which is what Invasion Fleet typically has to do. So you can go through and kill your opponent's utility units or their screens and stuff like that without actually having to deliver anything to their army. As long as the Red Terror can extricate itself from the fight by the end of the fight phase, it's going to be able to deal some damage. And with a Neuro Tyrant in the list as well, you're going to be able to push it to strength 8, which means its attacks are fairly consistent. We then have a pair of Hormigaunt squads, no attachments for them, just using them as disruption pieces. Some backline shooting from a pair of Exocrines and a Tyrannifex, this one with a Rupture Cannon for anti-vehicle work. We had a Lictor, a Von Ryan's Leaper unit, and a Biovore for utility, in addition to, last but certainly not least, a pair of Norn Emissaries. Now, this isn't using Talons of the Norn Queen, but of course, Invasion Fleet can give them lethal hits against monsters and vehicles, or sustained hits against infantry, which can make it so that they can deal some decent damage into, depending on the targets that you're fighting into. On top of that, Invasion Fleet gives them a kind of a semblance of Talons of the Norn Queen, because it's going to be able to give them a 5+, feel no pain, even when they're not on their singular purpose objective for a command point, thanks to rapid regeneration. So these things can, in some cases, survive a little bit longer than you would if you didn't have any of those defensive benefits. But that's not the only Tyranid we're discussing, because we're also going to hop over to the Winchester 40k GT and talk about an absolutely insane list from the combination of Assimilation Swarm and Talons of the Norn Queen. This is a cool combination because, of course, you can use Norn Assimilators, which are themselves a Harvester unit, which allows them to use a bunch of the stratagems inside Assimilation Swarm and heal themselves and other units around them. And Talons of the Norn Queen has a bunch of powerful buffs for them. That includes bonus strength, 4+ invulnerable save, and of course the ability to reselect their singular purpose target. Now in this case, we're playing a Neuro Tyrant in addition to a Tyranid Prime with Lash Whip. This guy taking parasitic biomorphology. I don't know if he is attached to any units. There is a 6 model unit of Zoanthropes as well as a 20 model unit of Hormigons. I'm going to assume that the Tyranid Prime is attached to the Hormigons, that's pretty classic, and the Neuro Tyrant is attached to the Zoanthropes. Both of these units, in addition to being pretty good on their own, have some massive synergies with Assimilation Swarm. The Neuro Tyrant and the Zoanthropes it allows you to bring back full Zoanthropes by using the detachment ability. Same thing for the Hormigons, where you can bring back 3 Hormigons at a time. It's not the easiest thing in the world to kill 20 Hormigons, and not like they're going to live forever, but there are 20 of them, and killing through the entire unit plus the Tyranid Prime oftentimes means that the Prime himself is going to be alive, or a couple Hormigons are going to be alive. You're going to be able to then regenerate them and potentially take objectives that they then recontrol. We have a Biovore for some utility, alongside a pair of Haruspexes, a pair of Maliceptors, a single Neurolictor, 1 Norn Assimilator with Synaptoprescience, this gives him a 4+ invulnerable save, 3 Psychophages to give just solid control in the center of the battlefield, plus they are Harvesters themselves, and they're not the easiest thing in the world to kill for their points. They also have a lot of anti-Psyker attacks, which means that they're actually pretty good into a lot of Psyker armies. So you're talking about things like Space Marines, like Thousand Suns, all these armies that are bringing lots of Psyker units. The Psychophages can actually get some pretty decent damage buffs against them, in addition to a couple of Pyrovores, 1 unit of 2, as well as a single individual Pyrovore. The unit of 2 is helpful because not only do you get the second Pyrovore for less, but you're also able to regenerate that entire Pyrovore back into the unit, because the detachment ability allows you, when you regenerate a unit, to either regenerate wounds, multiple models on Endless Swarm units, the little guys like the Hormigons, or a single infantry model, which could be a 5-wound Pyrovore in some cases, which does make that unit kind of difficult to kill for the points. But the other thing is that those Pyrovore units can be played aggressively. If your opponent destroys them, you have a stratagem to gain a wound bonus against units that destroyed your Harvesters. So you can use the Pyrovores as sacrificial lambs or utility units to push forward, lose them, and then gain a bunch of bonuses as well. You can also, when units are destroyed, small units like those Pyrovores or even Spore Mines, for example, you can use those to fuel additional regeneration, which is pretty cool. Now, discussing factions that had fewer X and O results, we can move over to the Bordeaux Open. This was a 100-player event that ran 5 rounds, which meant it had a lot of undefeated players at the end. And in this case, Robin Draws went undefeated 5-0 with an Imperial Knights list, running the combination of Dominus, Foebreakers, and Gate Warden Lance. That's taking a Knight Castellan with Augury Halo, in addition to a second Knight Castellan with Archaeotech Autoloaders. This case, oftentimes we see a push for more ranged attacks to benefit from that Gate Warden Lance detachment ability, giving them bonuses on their line of defense. But in this case, we are actually playing a ton of more faster, higher OC armigers. That includes 3 Helverins and 3 Warglaves. In addition to Watch Captain Artemis, kind of an interesting Imperial agent to bring there. He can regenerate himself back to life once per game after being destroyed on a 2+, which means he's kind of an awkward model to kill. And as we've discussed many times, independent solo characters pretty good in this edition because they can stand inside terrain and be difficult to shoot at. So he can be just holding down an objective or screening a corner of the board inside a gone to ground position. So you can only target him within 12 inches unless you can get full complete line of sight. Even if you target him, you have to kill him twice in order to actually wrest control of that objective or actually get on the objective itself, which of course will be counterattacked by Knight Castellans, which is not really a position you typically want to be in. We then also have a Sister of Battle Immolator, this one rocking a pair of Immolation Flamers and a Heavy Bolter, plus a Sisters of Battle Squad. This one is running a multi-melta and a melta-gun, so the full loadout of special weapons inside that unit. Now, last but certainly not least, we're going to move back on over to the Aether Force Gaming Summer Siege Warhammer 40k GT. This ended up being won by Brian Dougherty running Chaos Demons with a full 500-point score. So at the end of 5 games, 5 fully 100-point wins, no points lost over the course. Pretty impressive, and it's done with a Legion of Excess and Warp Tide combination. This obviously gives you much faster, more agile battle line units, which can be buffed then by the Legion of Excess detachment ability to, for example, strip off your fight first in order to give you rerolls, which, as we've discussed previously, is not that big of a downside in 11th edition, since if you only have fight normal attackers, the active player, meaning the player charging, will still get the first attacker anyway. So in some cases, if you don't have too many fights going on, the active player can essentially get rid of all their fights first and still act as if they were fighting first if their opponent doesn't have appreciable or any response attacks. Now, in this case, we're running a Contorted Epitome with a Demonette squad, Celeste with a second Demonette squad, as well as 2 Keepers of Secrets. One of them has the Dreaming Crown, another one with Soul Glutton. Then we have a Torment Bringer with False Majesty. No attachment for the Torment Bringer. We have 30 additional Demonettes, and we're following that up with a bunch of Beast units. That includes 1 Beast of Nurgle for utility and 3 Fiend units, 6 models in each of those for actual damage. Getting rerolls on those guys with devastating wounds is going to be able to do some pretty serious damage. And with the speed and high OC of the rest of the army, it's going to be able to complete its objectives fairly consistently, which it can do because it has the priority assets force disposition, which tends to be one of the more consistently scoring force dispositions. So a very scoring heavy build in general. But with that, those are all the best armies of Warhammer 40k for this week. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Big thanks to you for supporting the channel. Big thanks as well to Connell Narrative for sponsoring this video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.